you listened to our last episode about Carl Fabergé and his imperial eggs, we mentioned Tsar Alexander II and Jeff Bezos, two of the richest men to have ever lived, and it got us to thinking. Who was America's first multi-millionaire? How did they do it? And what became of their family and their fortune? Stick around as we dive into the life of America's first multi-millionaire, John Jacob Astor, his fortune, and some of his descendants right after this. Hey, road trippers! Welcome to another episode of the Road Tripping Podcast. I'm your host, Dean Ward.
And I am your host, Molly Malloy. As always, it's great to have you tuning in.
If this is your first episode, then welcome. If it's not your first episode, then welcome back. Each week, Molly and I take a drive along the information superhighway to find topics that we find interesting, obscure, funny, or downright bizarre, and then bring them to the show to share with you, our listeners, all in the hopes that we can make your commute suck just a little less.
You can find all previous episodes of the Road Tripping Podcast for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and now even our own app, which is available in the Google Play Store. To stream or download our show on your mobile device, start by opening your favorite app and typing the Road Tripping Podcast, that's tripping with a G, into the search bar. While you're there, be sure to subscribe to our feed so you'll have access to all of our previous shows, as well as all of the future goodness we're planning on bringing your way. If you have any difficulty in finding us, then check out our homepage at theroadtrippingpodcast.com/subscribe for a list of directories that, once clicked, will take you straight to our feed on that directory.
Now to the show. When Molly first asked me that question, my initial thought went directly to the Founding Fathers, specifically to George Washington, who I knew from watching the news was the wealthiest president to hold office until Donald Trump was elected. I thought that because he owned two large plantations totaling over 58,000 acres, was a slaveholder, and drew the equivalent salary as president of $700,000 in today's money, that he would have been the first multimillionaire. But that isn't the case.
That's right, Dean. And just so everyone is clear, we aren't talking about his wealth in today's terms, at least not unless we directly say we are, but in the value of it at the time it was earned during his lifetime, which is why he's considered the first U.S. multimillionaire. Johann Jacob Astor, later known as John Jacob Astor, was born into poverty in Waldorf, Germany, on July 17, 1763. As one of the four sons of the village butcher, Jacob Astor, and his wife, Maria Vorfilder. Despite his poor beginnings, Astor was able to receive a good but basic education up until he was 14 years old, when he went to work with his father. He did this for 2 years until his choices for employment became limited into following into his father's profession, some other modest trade, or heading out on his own. Astor didn't like the prospects for himself with the former choices, so he took the latter and immigrated to England to join one of his brothers. There, he learned to speak English, the business of making musical instruments, in particular flutes, and used the opportunity he was given to earn enough money for passage to America. In November 1783, after the Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolutionary War, Astor decided to set off across the ocean in the hopes for a better life, but it didn't look like it was going to start well. You see, just as he was about to reach the Chesapeake Bay in January of 1784, the ship Astor was aboard got stuck in ice. It would be 2 months before it was deemed safe for the passengers to land.
Astor had brought with him 7 flutes that he had been planning on selling once he reached America, but met a fellow passenger who claimed that he had traded for furs with the Indians in North America. The legend says that Astor quizzed the man extensively on the details of the fur trade, and by the time he set foot in Baltimore in March 1783, he was determined to get into the fur business. Astor headed to New York City, where another brother was living, and by some accounts we found during research, entered the fur trade almost immediately. He worked for several furriers between 1784 and 1785, in which he made trips to western New York to buy furs for his employers, purchasing some for himself at the same time. Eventually, he acquired enough furs to make a trip to England profitable. While in London, he established connections with a well-known trading house, signed an agreement to act as the New York agent for a musical instrument firm, and used his profits from the furs to buy merchandise to use for trade with the Native Americans. By 1786, Astor had opened a small shop on Water Street in Lower Manhattan, and throughout the 1790s he kept expanding his fur business. He was soon exporting furs to London and to China, which was emerging as a huge market for the pelts of American beavers, and by 1800, it was estimated that Astor had amassed a considerable fortune for the time of nearly $250,000. After the Lewis and Clark expedition returned from the Northwest in 1806, Astor realized he could expand into the vast territories of the Louisiana Purchase, and it should be noted, the official reason for Lewis and Clark's voyage was to help the American fur trade expand. In 1808, Astor combined several of his business interests into the American Fur Company. Astor's company, with trading posts throughout the Midwest and Northwest, would monopolize the fur business for decades, at a time when beaver hats were considered the height of fashion in America and in Europe. In 1811, Astor financed an expedition to the coast of Oregon, where his employees founded Fort Astoria, an outpost at the mouth of the Columbia River. It was the first permanent American settlement on the Pacific coast, but it was destined to fail due to various hardships and the War of 1812. Fort Astoria eventually passed into British hands. While the war doomed Fort Astoria, Astor made money in the final year of the war by helping the United States government finance its operations. Later, critics including the legendary editor Horace Greeley accused him of having profiteered in war bonds.
Trippers, keep in mind we aren't condoning the use of fur by anyone, as this is not our job here. We have received complaints from listeners on previous shows where it was suggested that we were taking an immoral and unethical side of an issue, which is completely not the case. We're just simply providing you with the facts based on the historical context of the time. For today's episode, the facts show that the fur trade was enormous for that time in history. But how did it develop, and what drove the prices that led Astor to make so much money? Let's take a closer look. Commercial fur trading in North America grew out of the early contact between the native Indians and European fishermen near Quebec. The natives would trade the pelts of small animals, such as mink, for knives and other iron-based products, or for textiles. In the beginning, exchanges were disorganized due to the low demand for the fur, so it wasn't until the late 16th century where the wearing of beaver hats became fashionable that established fur firms began looking for sources for furs. Now, since a high-quality fur pelt is only available where winters are severe, the trade took place predominantly in regions in what is now Canada, although some activity took place further south along the Mississippi River and in the Rocky Mountains. The first firms to participate in the fur trade were French, and under French rule, the trade spread all along the St. Lawrence and Ottawa rivers, and then down to the Mississippi. In the 17th century, following the Dutch, the English developed a trade through present-day Albany, New York. Then, in 1670, a charter was granted by the British Crown to the Hudson Bay Company, which began operating from posts along the coast of Hudson Bay. Over the next 100 years, this region saw competition between the French and the English. With the 1763 conquest by the British over the land of New France, which is now known as Quebec and Newfoundland today, the French trade shifted to Scottish merchants operating out of Montreal. After the negotiation of Jay's Treaty in 1794, which allowed for normalization of trade and navigation between Britain and America, the northern border was defined and trade along the Mississippi passed to the American Fur Company under John Jacob Astor. In 1821, the northern participants merged under the name of the Hudson Bay Company, and for many decades, this merged company continued to trade in furs until the 1990s. The fur trade was based on pelts destined either for the luxury clothing market or for the felting industries, of which hatting was the most important. This was a transatlantic trade. The animals were trapped and exchanged for goods in North America, and the pelts were transported to Europe for processing and final sale. As a result, forces operating on the demand side of the market in Europe and on the supply side in North America determined prices and volumes. while intermediaries like Astor, who linked the two geographically separated areas, determined how the trade was conducted. Hats today are not nearly as important as they once used to be, but for many, many years, they are a mandatory part of everyday dress for both men and women. As styles changed, as well as the political climates, hats took on various forms and shapes, from the high-crowned, broad-brimmed hat of the first two Stuarts to the conical-shaped plainer hats of the Puritans. What remained a constant, however, was the material from which the hats were made of: wool felt. Wool came from various animals, but towards the end of the 15th century, beaver wool began to be predominant. Over time, beaver hats became increasingly popular, eventually dominating the market. Only in the 19th century did silk replace beaver in high-fashion men's hats.
Now, just for context, we were able to locate some of the pricing paid out from the Hudson Bay Company. Around 1780, when Astor was getting into the fur trade, pelts ran from 9 to 12 shillings per pelt, which translated roughly to $2 US at the time, which was the price paid out to the trappers if they did not take goods in exchange, and represented about 2 or 3 days' worth of wages for skilled work, so there was a lot of incentive. However, where the real money was made was further along in the supply chain. The cost of the pelts was translated into cost per weight instead of for each pelt when they reached the wholesale market. So the same pelt that was bought for 10 shillings would be sold for, say, $5 to $8 in either New York or London. To put it in perspective in today's money, that same pelt would have been bought for less than $50 today and sold for 3.5 times as much, or somewhere around $180 US. While he was trading in furs, Astor also used his dealings to get into the general merchandising business. During the 1790s, he had begun to import and sell a large variety of European goods, and eventually spread into China. Between 1800 and 1812, his trade with China expanded to become a large part of his business dealings in Europe. The War of 1812 temporarily disrupted his plans, but it also gave him an opportunity to purchase ships at a bargain price, since declining trade had made other merchants anxious to dispose of their fleets. After the war, Astor had a large fleet of sailing vessels and again became active in China and Pacific trade. For a time, he was involved in the smuggling of Turkish opium, which is a very addictive drug, into China, but found the profits were not worth the risks and abandoned this venture. Between 1815 and 1820, he enjoyed a commanding position in trade with China, but he eventually got bored and turned his attention to other business activities. As you can see, Astor made a lot of money doing this, but he wasn't done. As the 19th century started to roll around, Astor had begun to realize that real estate was the next big market and the next big challenge for him. He determined that New York, in particular Manhattan, would continue to increase in size and figured it would be a good investment. So in June of 1834, he sold all of his interest in the fur business and concentrated on buying real estate in Manhattan, including much of Times Square, as well as having interests in money lending, insurance companies, banking, railroads and canals, public securities, and the hotel business. He ended up purchasing so much, he was eventually called the city's landlord. He profited not only from the sale of the lands and rents, but from the increasing value of lands within the city. During the last decade of his life, his incomes for rents alone exceeded $1.25 million. Astor died on March 29, 1848, with an estate that was estimated to have a value of between $20 and $30 million, or the equivalent of $605 to $907 million today, making him easily the Jeff Bezos of his day.
Now that we told you about Astor and where the fortune came from, let's get into the family he left it to when he died. On September 19, 1785, Astor married Sarah Cox Todd. Her parents were Scottish immigrants, Adam Todd and Sarah Cox. Although she brought him a dowry of only $300, she possessed a frugal mind and a business judgment that he declared better than most of any merchants. She assisted him in practical details of his business and managed Astor's affairs when he was away from New York until her death in 1842. Together, they had 8 children: Magdalena, Sarah Todd, who was stillborn, John Jacob Astor Jr., who was sickly and mentally unstable, William Backhouse, Dorothea, Henry, Eliza, and an unnamed son who died within a few days of birth. William Backhouse received the bulk of the Astor fortune when his father died, and having worked along the side of his father for many years, took that money and followed his father's example and invested heavily into real estate. He purchased his properties between Central Park and between 4th and 7th Avenue. By 1867, he had as many as 720 houses bringing in rental income. He was also invested in the railroads, coal, and insurance companies, which brought the family's worth to around $50 million upon his death in 1875. A fun fact about William Backhouse is that during the American Civil War, he successfully brought a case against the income tax imposed by the United States government, which was ruled unconstitutional.
From here on out, I'm going to need you to stick with us as we try to explain about William's children and subsequent generations as it gets a little complicated. William Backhouse Sr. had 7 children: Emily, John Jacob III, Mary Elida, Laura Eugenia, William Backhouse Jr., Henry, and Sarah Todd, who died in infancy. John Jacob III carried on adding to the family wealth as a financier with interest in the railroads and in real estate. He even served as a colonel in the Union Army during the American Civil War as a volunteer aide-de-camp to Major General George B. McClellan, who was the commanding general of the U.S. Army. He eventually moved to England and became the head of the English branch of the Astor family. William Backhouse Jr., however, had other ideas. He preferred the laid-back playboy approach to life. He spent most of his time aboard his yacht, the Ambassadress, which was at the time the largest yacht in the world at 146 feet 2 inches, riding and managing his horses on his 500-acre farm, or spending his time in Florida. Now, he did work some development projects in Florida, like a few hotels, a grapefruit orchard, and a small railroad, but these were pleasure projects for him and never built onto the family's wealth in a substantial way. He did start the town of Manhattan, Florida, located along the St. Johns River, and it did boom, eventually being renamed to Astor, Florida, in his honor.
Focusing on the American side of the Astor line, William Backhouse Jr. had 5 children: Emily, Helen, Charlotte, Caroline, and John Jacob, Jack, Astor IV. Of these, the most interesting one was Jack. He was a businessman, real estate developer, investor, a writer. He wrote a science fiction book called A Journey in Other Worlds in 1894. He was also a soldier during the Spanish-American War, where he personally financed a volunteer artillery unit, and a patent holder inventor. He also didn't like to be outdone. In 1893, William Waldorf Astor I, Viscount Astor, built a 13-story hotel known as the Waldorf next to his aunt's home, which was William Jr.'s wife, as part of a family dispute. Jack got back at his cousin, whom he disliked, a few years later, in 1897, by building his own bigger hotel, the Astoria, right next door. Eventually, the 2 hotels were joined, resulting in the first Waldorf Astoria. However, it stood on what became the site of the Empire State Building, so it doesn't exist anymore. What most of our listeners today will know him for, though, is the fact that poor old Jack was returning home to America with his pregnant second wife aboard the ill-fated White Star ocean liner, the RMS Titanic, and died sometime after it sank on April 15, 1912. No one is exactly sure when or exactly how, but unlike the 1997 James Cameron movie, he was either last seen clinging to the side of a raft or was killed by a falling smokestack. However it happened, his body was found on April 22, 1912, by the cable ship Mackay Bennett as body number 124. His wife and unborn child survived the accident aboard lifeboat number 4. At the time, he was worth $87 million, or $2.2 billion today, making him the richest passenger aboard the Titanic. In an interesting twist, the inquiry into the accident was held in New York City in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel just 4 days later on the 19th. More leads, less effort. Sounds good, right? Social Beat offers social media management tools, training, and teams to help you with content creations, hosting, recycling, and more. Automatically post on all major networks. Organize your content into categories for the best content mix. Effortlessly repost your evergreen content for maximum impact. And save lots of time in the meantime. To help the show and get your 14-day free trial, follow the link in the show notes or by clicking on the banner on our homepage at theroadtrippingpodcast.com. We use them and think you should too. Join the hype today. Hello, Trippers. Do you have a podcast that you want to cross-promote? Or are you a business with a product that you would like to advertise? Then reach out to us at theroadtrippingpodcast.com to see how we can help. Your success is our success, so let us succeed together by getting the word out about your product or show to other listeners and potential consumers. We're going to close this episode out with a more recent Astor story some of you may have followed, which was Brooke Astor, the third wife of Vincent Astor, Jack's son from his first marriage, and the case of elder abuse and financial scam carried out by her only child, Tony Marshall. There is lots and lots of literature out there on this subject, and I will link a very good Vanity Fair article in the show notes all about it. However, that said, even though Tony was a United States ambassador to several countries, an operative for the CIA, an author, and a Tony Award-winning Broadway producer, he used his position over his 100-year-old mother, who was suffering from Alzheimer's, to transfer property to his wife's name, paid wages from her accounts, fired housekeepers and other staff in Brooke's name to prevent them from receiving money upon her death, had the greenhouses removed and the flower beds covered over, made multiple extremely large financial gifts, siphoned off money that was to be set aside for charitable donations, started a production company with Brooke's unknowing backing, and refused to provide proper medical care for her. He even tried to get the Astor's fortune that Brooke controlled after Vincent's death transferred to his control. This guy was stone cold to his mother, but he wanted everyone else to think that they were on the best of terms. He even told people that she died in his arms, yet he wasn't even in the same state at the time. At the end, he was found guilty on 14 of 16 counts against him, was sentenced to 1 to 3 years, but allowed to go free pending appeals. Normally, his conviction would have cost him a 25-year sentence, if not for his age of 85. He was eventually sent to prison in 2013, but only served 2 months before he was paroled due to the state's medical parole ruling of 1992 that allowed inmates paroled if they were too sick or frail. But to beat it all, he still ended up inheriting $14.5 million.
We hope you've enjoyed our look into the first multimillionaire in America and the interesting history of the family. Believe us when we say that this is truly just the highlights, and it would take a lot more time to give all the stories justice. Well, that's all the time we have for in this episode of the Road Tripping Podcast. But if you liked it and want to hear more, please subscribe to the show feed and give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast directory. The more positive reviews we receive, the more trippers will be able to find us, and the faster we will grow, thus being able to bring you new content. Be sure to visit our website, theroadtrippingpodcast.com, that's tripping with a G, to keep updated on future shows, leave show suggestions, and to see all the ways to find and interact with us all in one place. If you're able and feeling generous, then a link to our Patreon page can be found under the support link on the homepage. We have been your hosts, Dean Ward and Molly Malloy, and the Road Tripping Podcast is recorded and produced at Before Midnight Studio. As always, until next we meet, stay safe, trippers.